Hello. Uh, for today's readings, I'm going to focus more on the gospel than on the first reading. St. Augustine says that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, and in the Muslim tradition, they say that God is closer to us than our jugular vein is. I like that image more than the loincloth, so I'm going to stick with the gospel today. And in our gospel, Jesus gives us these two strange images for the reign of God. Maybe not strange to us because we've heard these most of our lives, some of us, but strange in his time because they seemed not what the people were expecting about what the reign of God would be like. He talks about the reign of God being like a mustard seed, a tiny, tiny seed that grows into a huge, big tree. And he talks about the reign of God being like a woman who puts a little bit of yeast into a dough and kneads it, and then whole loaf of bread or loaves of bread rise. So we've heard these before. How do we make sense of them in general? How do we make sense of what they're saying about the reign of God and our role in bringing it about in 2020 in this very odd, very long summer that we're all having? There seems to be these three things that we can hear in these parables. And the first is the most obvious one, the one we probably heard before, to ask about how God works through things that are small, things that are hidden, people who are small or seemingly small to do amazing things. Um, God seems to work through people that don't get noticed, people that are simply giving of themselves in ways that no one realizes until we see the effects. My university uses a software program called Starfish to try to track students, especially when they're not doing so well. That relates to that old story about a little kid at the beach who's taking individual starfish and throwing them back in the ocean to help that starfish. That's those little acts mean something. I think that's one starting point for this parable, that our little acts for the reign of God, even if they're small and even if they're hidden, even if no one notices, are part of how this reign of God is coming. It's not coming through big fireworks most of the time. It's not coming through huge attacks most of the time. It's coming through our small acts of fidelity to God and God's message. Jesus died an outcast criminal, and honestly, most people probably didn't even know who he was his times. He was hidden as well. He was small as well, and we have this image of the small and the hidden to start with. But that brings me to my second point, which is related. Is about the role that death plays in both of these parable images. Um, Seeds die in order to become what they become, or at least seem to die and are transformed. There's a reason why Jesus uses the same image in the Gospel of John, where it talks about unless a grain of wheat shall fall to the ground and die, it remains but a single grain. We have the same agricultural image of the seed dying. Yeast dies to make the bread. Once you put the bread in the oven, the yeast get killed. Um, that's not to be morbid, and it's not to sort of encourage us to go out there and become martyrs. But I think that it does say that our actions for the reign of God always have a cost. Our actions for the reign of God seem to always involve somehow death to self, um, death to our own will, and being part of God's will. Now, that can be misused, and in fact, in the history of Christianity, that was used lots to keep people who are already disempowered down and from doing their own thing. But I think there's something true to it still. A Benedictine Trappist monk I like named Michael Casey says there could be no genuine spirituality does not take seriously the gospel imperative of the paschal mystery. We enter life through the doorway of death. And that's true of the seed, it's true of the yeast, that um, we, like Jesus, somehow bring about new life and bring about the reign of God in ways that are personally costly, but in ways that are precious in God's eyes. And the third thing that I think that these two images tell us about in relationship to the reign of God and who we are is about time. You notice that both of the images here take time. You don't get uh, a plant right away. You don't get a tree right away. If you've been spending the summer gardening, you have a much better sense than I do. I'm not really a garden person, but you have a better sense that you can't force a plant to grow. You simply have to be present and wait for it. And the plants that come up the fastest and the furious are often the ones that die when it gets hot again, like it has now. Or yeast, if you've been baking this summer, or learning how to bake this summer, or relearning how to bake this summer, you know you can't force the dough to rise faster than it's going to. It has its own tempo, its own time. That can be a reason to keep putting off whatever we're doing for another day. We got plenty of time. But it also might be a comfort for those of us that get frustrated with our own imperfections, get frustrated with the system not moving fast enough, get frustrated with the way in which the church still fails us. And by the church, I don't mean just our leaders, I mean our families, our fellow Christians at a whole bunch of levels. That impatience is good because it keeps us moving. On the other hand, we are works in progress. You're not done yet. I'm not done yet. There's something about these parables that God gives us and gives the world the time that he thinks it needs to grow into what it's supposed to become. That might be a comfort for those of us in the DC area who want what we want and want to be holy now. Holiness is like a tree growing. Holiness is like the yeast rising. It's going to take some time to happen. So with those three things then, a sense of the importance of our individual small daily acts, even if they might be small and hidden, that's the way that God is choosing to bring about the reign of God, and he's doing it in his own good time. So if we think of that, if we think about we're called to go out into the world and be seeds of justice through our small and our big actions to make the world the reign of God that it's supposed to be. We're called to be the yeast that goes into the world and helps humanity and the rest of creation grow into what God has always dreamt it could be. But at the end of the day, God is the woman who's making the bread. God is the gardener who's growing the trees. God is the chef who is preparing the banquet of the reign of God. And our job is to do our little bit. And our job, thank goodness, is also to show up and be invited to that table.